let's get started. Thank you for joining us for another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta, as always, and today our guest is Michael Tierney of Wildstar fame, a regular of Kursova with his new project that is currently on Kickstarter, and that's the Sky Dance of Winter Fire. How are you doing today, Mr. Tierney?
Oh, doing great. I really appreciate y'all having me here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Anthony, how are you doing?
As you know, Ben, I've never had a bad day in my life.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Mr. Tierney, why don't you tell us about the Sky Dance of Winterfire?
All right, well, the Skydance of Winterfire, it's two stories in one. It's a reality story about a personal experience that actually happened to me here at my home in my backyard. And it's a fantasy story that kind of evolved out of that. And it's being published by Kursova magazine. And I had written it up into a short story and showed it to Kursova, showed it to another publisher. Both were interested and said, yeah, we want to do it. But this is such a descriptive type of thing. It's got so many great visuals. We want to see this as an illustrated story. And I didn't. I used to do artwork myself a long time ago. I was really active in art, but I ran two bookstores for like 40 years until the pandemic hit, and then I cut back and I took on all these writing contracts, like 11 books in 2 years to put out, and then I concentrated on that after I closed my stores and just turned my businesses over into mail order. But once I got the big project, the biggest one of them, the Robert E. Howard Art Chronology, 360,000 words over 7,000 images. I mean, that thing was a monster, 1,600 pages. And I delivered it print ready. So once I delivered that, well, then I had time to start working with artwork again. And, I discovered this new type of AI generated artwork. Well, I'm an artist already. I used to do it, like I say, all my own artwork, pencils, inks, the whole show. And then also I do a online comic strip for Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. called Beyond the Farthest Star. And the first 100 episodes of that I colored. So and then also on the chronology, I also did a Edgar Rice Burroughs art chronology. So those put together, that was like 13,000 images altogether. And now some of them were over 100 years, and I was old, and I was having to do major restorations. I mean, I sometimes on a pulp that's over 100 years old, I would put a 40-hour work week in to restore because you got to try to make all the pixels match with the dot patterns of the print process in the day, back when it was letterpress. And I was going down to the single pixel level to make sure everything just matched so it looked seamless, so that every image looked like it was just brand new off the printing press today. Kind of gave you a trip through a time machine. So all that work with Photoshop, mixed with my own art background, I thought, well, shoot, I'm just going to illustrate this thing myself. And I started also working with that Mid Journey, and so my work on the art side of the Skydance Winterfire is about 40% photographic because I was trying to capture this event in my backyard. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. And about 40% Photoshop, another 20% AI generated to create certain elements. And there's some things that you can really do that are nice. And with this Mid Journey stuff, it does really great watercolors. I did most of mine in oil paint. I only got one image that's a watercolor that's on the back cover, but the oil painting process on Photoshop looks pretty good. The watercolor stinks; it's awful. And you know, but the opposite way on the Mid Journey. The Mid Journey can do really good watercolor, so I might do more with that in the future. But I was using it to create elements, and then so I could create, build the composition of what I knew I wanted to do because I already had an image in my head. This is what I want to do, and so I was pulling from multiple sources to create those images. Now the story behind Skydance and Winterfire, and I'm going to use an out of date term here, so I hope it's not too politically incorrect. Have you ever heard of an Indian summer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's when you have a warm snap in the middle of a cold winter. And we had one of those here in Arkansas. I'm here in Maumelle, Arkansas, and that's a town with a name with a history that is another topic. But especially if you know Old French, but the the warm snap hit. Well, I have my backyard. Let's put it this way: the neighbors probably don't like me too much because I'm not one of these guys who keeps my ground scalped. Oh, always got to show the grass even in the winter, and I just let leaves and everything out there because what it is I have fireflies every night from spring to fall. Now, fireflies have very short lives. They gestate in the ground for about 3 years before they come out, and then they're only up for maybe 3 days to a week. And having them come out constantly tells you I've just got multiple generations living in my yard. And so I leave the winter cover on there and clean it up when it gets to be spring and start mowing again. But all these fireflies got confused by this snap of warm weather. And I mean, I literally had thousands of fireflies coming out, and then it turned cold again. And have you ever seen winter fireflies?
I'm afraid I
It's a real
haven't.
rare. Yeah, it's a real rare thing. Normally, a firefly, when you see it, it's just blink, blink, just very casual in its mating dance, sticking around close to the ground. But when it turned cold, my God, these things were like they were on crystal meth or cocaine or something. Like you heard of cocaine bear? These were like cocaine fireflies. I mean, they just swarmed this gigantic pine tree in the park behind my yard, and I mean, they were just flashing and flashing and flashing. I'd never seen a Christmas tree that sparkled like that. I mean, it was just the wildest sight I ever saw. So I'm out there with my cameras. I'm an underwater photographer, and cameras are. But photography is a hobby of mine, and I just couldn't get a good image shooting them at night. I tried to get a video camera out. That didn't work either. So I had to use artwork to show that part of the story. Well, while all this is going on with the fireflies, I was like, man, people aren't going to believe what I see. And I just got to figure out a way to show this to people. At the same time, I was moving a pile of old firewood closer to my house to burn up in the fireplace when it got cold again, and brought in some new firewood. Well, while I'm moving that, I disturbed this little colony of bugs, and I got to thinking, man, wonder what these guys think of me. I'm probably like to them, like some giant Cthulhu monster just comes storming through the world, stomping and destroying everything. And so in the I start out with the description, of the real, and then I move into the surreal, where I kind of give you the fictionalized kind of modern day fairy tale of what happened to those bugs in their fight for survival against Cthulhu man. That would be me, and the giant predatory fireflies, because fireflies are predatory. And so once they mate, then they want to eat and go in the ground and hibernate and have babies. And so they were on the menu, and all of a sudden I tore up their home. Now here they got to survive, and so I worked up a story to go with that. And so that is the dance of the Sky Dance of Winterfire.
Nice.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, what I'm asking is this from the perspective then of the fireflies? Like,
No, it's from the perspective of the bugs. Now the bugs I disturbed, they were just some brown, very nondescript looking bugs. That's not very visual. So for the store, I switched them to ladybugs, which are very cute, and I have lots of them in my yard. And but and then also too, I took it another step, and when I illustrated them, I went to anthropomorphic. So everything else is done in realistic, but the ladybugs they're anthropomorphized. Like you've got one bad, the kind of the villain ladybug. Well, I designed him as like, okay, what would Genghis Khan look like if he was a ladybug? And that's the bad guy. And just you got the male ladybug got to go to romance with the ladybug, and then they're trying to fight, survive because when I disturbed their home, all of a sudden they were exposed to all the other predators' yards, big spiders and this and that.
interesting. Are you I mean I'm sure you are, but I'm just curious about the influence here. You're familiar with Watership Down?
No, I'm not.
I'm a little
Mic
surprised.
off.
It was a big it was also an animated movie from the 80s. So Watership your story reminds me of Watership Down. So Watership Down
Oh, Watership Down.
is
I've heard of it. About animals living like under a boat or something like that, or animals, and they're kind of anthropomorphized by.
you're
I think it is. Yeah, I've never
you're
read
on
it,
the
but I've heard of it.
border of what it's about. So Watership Down is about rabbits.
Mhm.
And one of the and he creates like the society and mythology for rabbits, and one of the rabbits named Fiver gets a prophecy that their warren is going to be destroyed, so his brother Hazel gets a group of like 5 rabbits, and they decide they're going to go off and find to like a mythical sort of land of milk and honey called Watership Down, which is a real field in England you could visit today,
Okay.
and it would have probably been like 2 miles away or something like that.
Hmm.
Uh, but he writes the story in the style of like a Homeric epic, and not it's not poetry, so it's not in that way. But what I mean is that he keeps interspersing it with like the rabbit mythology about their folk heroes, and your story reminds me very much of it. And humans in the story are looked at as like they're like the gods, you know.
Are they? Yeah.
They're so, for example, one very memorable scene in Watership Down involves they decide they're going to do. There's a neighboring warren. They reach Watership Down successfully after many hardships. They're all alive, but they realize they don't have any does in the warren, so they can't propagate. They can't grow their warren. So they investigate. There's a large warren that's relatively nearby, and they go to investigate, and they learn that the warren is like a tyrannical, almost what we would call a fascist state ruled by a dictator, and that some of the does there are kidnapped. So they resolve that they're going to try and liberate some of the does. And one of the most memorable scenes is they're escaping from the Afrafin Warren. That's the name, you know, the other Warren with some of the does. And they cross railroad tracks, and behind them, a train hits the rabbits that are chasing them. And they don't tell you in the text that it's a train, but knowing context clues that, you know, their train tracks, something came out of nowhere and basically just exploded the rabbits behind them. And they're like, you know, they, as far as they're concerned, it was the interference of the gods, right?
Yeah.
Like the gods just came in and through, they don't know why, but for some reason they decided to save them, you know. And the same thing happens at the end of the book where Hazel is you know, he's trapped on the farm, and then and then there's a chapter that's literally called like Deus Ex Machina or something, where the farmer's daughter says, "Daddy, look, there's a rabbit trapped under the barn. Let's bring it back to the warren." And then Hazel's talking about it later, and he's like, I don't know why, but for some reason this time the gods favored me, you know, and that's how the rabbits view it. So your story reminds me very much of Watership Down. You take this animal view of life, you know, among of life in the world, and how they would view society, and how they would view, you know, things that we don't consider at all as being conflicts, but are massive earth-shaking events to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you look at it from their perspective. Do you have anything in your story? I'm now just curious because I've made that Watership Down connection in my head, even though you didn't intend it. But do
Yeah.
you have anything with religion, or you know, anything in like the belief system of the ladybugs in the story?
No, they're more just kind of grounded in reality. You know, just they have a history a little bit, but not very long history because they go through so many generations so fast, just every year. And so I'm just what they call the giants, and just how and like the wood pile they're living in, that's a mountain of wood and things like that, and just they find little places to live. And of course, the fireflies to them are the monsters from underground, and that's just kind of like a adventure horror story for the ladyflies. I mean, ladyflies, ladybugs, and then like I said, they look pretty good graphically. Matter of fact, do you have where you can show maybe some pages or images from my Kickstarter or from my website?
Mic on.
Yeah,
Oh,
I have the Kickstarter up in the background now. One of the things that I did want to talk to you about, and you were talking about it right before it started, was your use of AI in creating it.
hmm
Uh, so tell us more a little bit about, because this is a big controversy going on right now, right, among creators. In it hit the, you know, I was talking, it's interesting, in like the education world I've seen articles where people are going like, this happened to math teachers first when calculators came out. They were like, well, what's the point of teaching math? Then it's spread now with chat gpt, it is right starting to spread into the English world. Well, what's the point of teaching writing? Now, I know for a fact, because I know people who have done this, for example, just from a writing perspective, you could get good grades on essays that are written pretty much entirely via chat gpt, right? Submit them at like master's level. I know people, they've told me like, yeah, I've done it. Yeah, like it's a thing that can happen now. And you know, I've made poetry through chat gpt that's better than what I could do. So I'm starting to think it's like right now we're still at the point where you could recognize the differences between human and AI, you know, stories and things. There are certain things it can't do. That is not going to last forever. That's going to change very soon as it gets more advanced. We're going to reach the point where it will be very hard to tell the difference between human and AI. So I'm curious how you've decided to use it in your artwork. What's your take on the whole controversy surrounding it?
All right. Well, on my website, I published the article. I have dealing with just that in the back of the book, where the article. Let me pull it up on my website here. It was I titled it "The Evolution of the Publishing Process," and I'm a former journeyman printer. So I worked in printing all my life. I mean, I was from being working at the mailroom during school. A paper boy from fourth grade on and into the mailroom, and then journeyman printer at the age of 22. I was managing my own printing division. Then at the age of 27, I've been self-published myself. I put out a magazine called The Multiversal Scribe back in like 1977. And that was using what was then brand new technology. So I've watched this evolution happen a bunch of times because you had used to do inking on your art. You had to have the bottle of ink, the little quill pen, you'd dip it and you'd scratch. And then Pentel came out with these rollerball pens with a new water based ink. And I mean, I just went wild with that because I created 22 illustrations for my magazine. I did all these different stories, all of them in a different genre, and illustrated all myself because I could do so much more with that artwork with that control of the ink that way. And over the years, and of course, used to back then, I had to lay everything out with a T square and this and that. And I show images of all this stuff in the article, and it's also you can read it, get previews of it on my website, or you can see it on the actual Kickstarter listing because the Kosovo is listing them, showing it in sections, as updates. And I've watched the technology change now. When I first published that, multiversal scribe, the typesetting that required, typesetting to be done where you had to take it to a typesetter. These guys with piker rulers and they'd have to hand type it in, retype everything into the machine. That changed, when I was doing my comics later in the around 2001, 2002. You didn't need a typesetter anymore. You could just load it in with the text box. Well, before that point, these originally, let's back up about 100 or 200 years ago. Let's go way back. Gutenberg Bible, lead type in reverse because it's letterpress. So you had to put everything in reverse because it just would stamp. That's the letter was pressed to the paper. Well, then in the around the 60s, like that, all of a sudden offset printing came in, and that's when they started doing things like cold type, and that's when you could actually do the type the way it looked because then you'd put it on a roller, and then that roller would offset it onto the
Mic
paper,
off.
because you put the ink on the roller, and the roller then would transfer the paper, the ink to the paper, and that's where offset printing came from. And of course, now we've gone yet another evolution to digital. But so you've seen all these different technologies have changed everything as it goes along. And so, but if you go back up into about like 1890, you had what you call composers. Guys would have to put every letter of type in, and they had to do it in reverse. And so, that was a high paid job. Well, then along comes this machine called linotype, where you could just type it in, and the machine would drop the letters in, and so that put a whole bunch of people out of work. One of the guys that put out of work was a guy by the name of Bob Davis. So he started becoming a journalist for the paper. Then the paper started collapsing because there were just too many of them. And then he was hired by Muncie magazine. He's like, hey, just go until we find another newspaper to work at. Go through these slush piles and see if you can find anything that's any good because nobody thinks any of this stuff's any good. But see if you can find anything good in the junk. We found, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Princess of Mars, Tarzan of the Apes, things like that. And so he is the guy who developed what he called pseudoscience stories. And then later, he kind of retired around the 1920s. Well, that's about the time Gernsback was coming along, and he saw all these pseudoscience stories. Go, hey, let's do science fiction. That does not roll off the tongue very well. Later, it became science fiction. And so, if it hadn't been for the invention of linotype, Bob Davis would have never had to go find another job. Would have discovered Burroughs, and he was the guy who really nurtured all these science fiction writers of the day. I mean, there's a whole long list of people. I talk a lot about that in the introduction to my Edgar Rice Burroughs art chronology. And
Yeah, not to cut you off. I'll let you continue in a second, but this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine with the whole Frankenstein was the origin of science fiction crowd. There is a sense in which you could say that that is sort of true, but in reality, the entire field in which science fiction grew out of did not root from Frankenstein. Frankenstein, you might be able to identify in retrospect as an early proto science fiction story, but it was not the root from which science fiction grew out of. Those were the pulps.
many
That's where
fathers,
the
many mothers,
came
yeah.
from.
And this is a guy, Bob Davis. He was a guy who was really encouraging this type of fiction in the pulps. If he hadn't been encouraging, who knows if we'd had it? I mean, so other people took it and ran with it beyond that. Uh, Unfortunately for Bob David, he retired once, came back, and then I guess he just kind of lost his knack for it, and he was turning down stories like the Linsman series by Doc E. Davis. Ah, it's just too far out. And Gernsback snapped it up, and Amazing Stories just ran wild with it, and then he retired again, and he was done being an editor. But but that's the whole thing is that he had to find other work, and he did well. But that's just kind of like a domino. But so the linotype, that was the way everything was done until about the 60s. And that's when the cold type came in with the offset printing. And so when all of a sudden computers started coming along with the typesetting, where you put you could actually type it on your computer and just copy it in a text box. Well, they were laughing at that. They're like, man, that's all fuzzy. That doesn't reproduce well. And then they figure out how to do vector based and other things like that, make it sharp. And now everything is done that way because it's all doing digital printing. So you don't need typesetters. The whole industry was completely gone. So I've seen whole industries lose out and completely go away. When I was working in printing, that was the number one employer in America. I mean, because there were more jobs in printing than any other industry around in the United States. And then when computers started coming along, well, all of a sudden I can do on my Mac laptop what used to you'd have to have a whole print shop with cameras and all sorts of different specialized equipment to do. Now you can just do it all on your own Mac laptop, and you the Edgar Rice Burroughs, not the Edgar Rice Burroughs, but the Robert E. Howard chronology that I just turned in. I turned in the files print ready. Well, I sent them to the publisher. They just that same day they shot them on to the printer because like, hey, we know your stuff's going to be good. We don't even need to look at it. We're just going to send it straight to the printer, and they already have it printed now. They're getting a size for slipcases. So that's how things have changed. Used to you'd write stuff, and you go through all these other people, and now it can be all so self-contained. And so that's just one other example of how technology has changed and put some people out of work. Now I know a lot of artists are worried about maybe this is going to put people out of work and this and that. I'm not too worried about that because you still got to have the concept. You still got to have the idea. Now if you're a hack artist, yeah, you probably got a lot to worry about. But if you're somebody who has original
Mhm.
concept and original ideas, I think you're going to be okay because you still need that imagination and the concepts to come up with because AI has got to be told what to do. Now, the way I'm using it, I'm not using it like these guys. Like, I know one of the big complaints against AI is that people will use it to go and, go surfing the internet to pull images and create a composite on it. I don't do that. I've had some people who do that. They tell me, "Oh, you're doing it the hard way. You shouldn't do it the way you're doing it." But what I do is I don't do it that way. I'll put in so I've got my own website. And so I created a shadow page on my website. So I would take my photography, load it into this page. Then I'd go over to Midjourney and direct it to those images I just loaded up, create the images I want, get the elements. Rarely did I ever use an actual image, but I've used sections of it or pieces of it, sometimes just tiny pieces, and pull all the images I wanted to work with. And then I go take them down on the web so nobody else can come along with a one of these search engines and little AI bots going, reading everything on the website. It's gone, so I immediately would take it back down after I got done creating my images. So I'm using it as a tool to work with my
Mhm.
work. And I'm not telling it, okay, I want you to give me the work of so and so artist. I'm not doing that. The style I put in there, if I because there you do need to kind of let it know what kind of art style you're wanting. I'm going for I can't even say the word Roscoe or whatever, kind of the Rembrandt style of dark and light, playing with light and shade.
Mic
That's
Mhm.
what
on.
I wanted.
I get
Chiaroscuro.
that.
There you go. Yeah, you say it better than I can. Well, that's the style
Mic
I wanted to
off.
work in. And as a matter of fact, I've got one page on that article about the evolution of publishing, where I show the process about trying to get that chiaroscuro. And I know I butchered it, but trying to get that element into the art, and trying to create all these different images on Midjourney until I get enough pieces that I can build the image I wanted to put together. And so I show you all the different things that I worked with to pull different things from it until I can get to the image that I wanted. And so I show you all the work pieces, you might say, that went into creating the piece I call Cthulhu Man or Cthulhu Man, however you want to say that. So I've got there that's on the website too, kind of showing you my work process, and then I'll show you all a lot of the other stuff I've done over the years. including restorations and this and that.
Interesting. So this is where, when I look at this, I see it from a couple perspectives. Uh, all technology as it advances, there's an evolution of it. Eliminates jobs, it creates jobs. The problem
Mhm.
is when the new jobs are created, most of the time it is at a higher skill level, right? So as computers go in, you lose jobs in lower skill levels, but jobs open up for people with higher skill levels.
Yeah.
This creates the problem with like college as a barrier to entry and things like that, right? But this is a little bit different, and this is what I mean. One of the differences with this, and I guess it's also true with computers as well for that matter, but it's that I happen to know authors, not artists, authors, who use this new AI art tool in order to create covers for their books. And I have heard people, anytime anybody says, this is why I'm always kind of skeptical, it's like, oh, you could still tell it's not human. It's like, well, you can now and not always. But because they will say, like, don't do it, it's not worth the price, and then they'll come up with a cover and they'll go like, did you realize this was AI? Probably not. And then they'll explain what they did, and it's always, don't get me wrong, it's always more simple than I plug this in and 5 minutes later I had a cover. But the key here is that these people were not artists, and they were able to do it themselves, and really important in this, without paying someone else. So cover art is one of the things, and just making a good cover, it is legitimately, I could tell you from my experience in being in this field, not that I've self-published a lot, I've worked with mid-list publishers though, and getting good cover art and good covers is one of the most difficult things about publishing indie. And you don't want to admit that it makes a big difference, because that seems shallow, but it does. It makes a massive difference. You can immediately tell a badly made cover that this is not a professional work, right? Does that mean that the writing inside isn't going to be good? It doesn't necessarily, but you're automatically going to be inclined to take it less seriously and to not pick it up, right? Uh, One of those things, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
I just did two big art chronologies on Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, talking about the importance of cover art, and how certain artists would be better. Like when the Conan paperbacks are coming out from Lancer, and they had a really good artist by the name of Drillo, and he was a very accomplished artist, but hey, he wasn't Frank Frazetta, and people just hated on his covers because they were so used to seeing the Frank Frazetta art, and they didn't like Drillo's art. And he was not a bad artist, but you can't get the Howard fans to admit that because they're like, nah, I wanted that Frazetta. So yeah, art is just ultra important. I mean, and it does. A good cover will sell more work than a bad cover or a mediocre cover. I mean, there was one guy who, poor guy, he was doing a cover, and it is one of the worst covers on the Burroughs book called The Fighting Man from Mars. It was a good concept, a wraparound. You had ships flying all over the place, but the guy was sick as a dog, and he said it. I was reading a biography with him and interview he gave, and he was so sick that he had to lie on his back and paint with his artboard above him just to meet the deadline. And he was a one-legged man because he lost a leg in World War II. Well, then comes this woman, sees the one-legged man lying on the floor. She thought he died on the job. Screamed so loud she cracked the glass on his door, which I thought was an hilarious story. But so it's a great story, but it's an awful piece of artwork. Good concept, good layout, but it just didn't have the execution. Of course, the guy was sick as a dog trying to just deliver.
yeah.
So you can tell when there's good artwork and when there's not good artwork, and it does affect sales for sure. I see with me and my stores. I mean, that's one of the things I did. All the purchasing for 40 years, where I'd have to predict what people wanted to read before they even knew about it. And the cover art had a lot to do with my decisions of what am I going to carry on the shelves.
Yeah, if you this is a little, well, what I was going to say is this is a little bit off the topic of where I was getting at initially, but one thing that I noticed that's incredibly difficult to get right, really, like, honestly a harder skill than the artwork itself in my estimation. And by that I don't mean creating artwork for a cover, but you can generally find artwork that works okay for a cover. What will make or break whether your cover is professional looking is actually the lettering. uh, and it is so hard to get the lettering just right. You could generally tell, like, immediately your mind will snap to that looks like somebody put it together themselves. Yeah. And if you were to ask like a random person, including myself, at least for a long time, like why, I couldn't really tell you. It's like the letters are they, is there something wrong with the letters? No, not really. But something about the way they're interacting with the image. You could tell a professional didn't do it. But that's a little bit off of what I was getting at. What I was trying to get at is that it's now offered this new opportunity for indie authors not to have to pay. I'm literally just throwing a number out there. I don't know going rates because I've published with mid-list companies. I haven't self-published myself, but uh, and indie publishers who have done it for me. But like $500 to an artist or something. I don't know. That might be high. That might be low. I'm not sure. But
Depends on
like,
the artist.
yeah, so instead of having to throw out, a few $100s to an artist to make your cover for you, you could do it yourself. And
Well,
you could
even
do it it's a big difference.
yeah, well, I was gonna say even before AI came along, and something that a lot of people don't recognize is with Photoshop. Because if Photoshop came along like 20 years ago, and or 25 years ago now, and I'm sure it was around before that, but that's when it started coming into the publishing industry and being used quite a bit, especially in comics to create covers. And but with Photoshop, what a lot of people have been doing is using actual photos to
Yeah,
incorporate into their artwork. Just throw on some filters and say, "Hey, I've got an original piece of artwork," and all you're doing is paying for very minimal work. You're not paying for an artist to create the concept and do all the different layers. I mean, and so that's kind of been going on even before AI was coming along. That people were using shortcuts and other elements to create their work, and
yeah,
you're paying for the full price, like you got original composition, but you're not.
that's another reason too. I think that in many ways, or at least in some very specific ways, lettering is even more important because there are professional looking books that I don't know how to describe it except to say that you could tell immediately looking at it, like, oh, this was put out by a publisher. It has that level of quality. Where the cover is, a solid color or it's very simple. I have, for example, I just got it, The Land Across by Gene Wolfe. If you look at the cover of this book, it is red. The font of the letters is looks a little bit like what you would see in like communist Russia, the Soviet Union. Uh, and there's train tracks on it. Extremely simple. If you gave me a stock image of train tracks, red filter, and the right font size, I could recreate the cover. But, or at least I would think I could. I couldn't, right? If you were to ask me if I knew nothing about the industry, could you recreate this cover? A random person would probably go, it doesn't seem that complicated. But the lettering, the way that the lettering interacts with the background and things, and it looks right. You know, it looks like, yeah, okay, this is something a professional did immediately. And then it's good. On the flip side, I've seen beautifully written pieces of art where the lettering just clashes completely. And you could go, that was self published, wasn't it? Yeah, like that immediately. Yeah, somebody put that out on their own. So I see this growth in the ability to do this for yourself as maybe not. It won't hurt the artist. I don't know. At the very least, it's something new for artists to learn, and the good artists, yourself for example, can use it to enhance their work. Right?
That's what I'm
Uh,
using for, right?
yeah. So that's a good thing. But I also see it as something that's really good for the small and even mid-list authors who are trying to put their work out there and who want to save some money in creating a cover. It creates an opportunity. And again, like you said, this is not the first time that people have had the opportunity to do that, right?
Oh yeah,
They've been able to do it in different ways in the past, but this is a new avenue for that
yeah.
that I do think is a good thing.
Yeah. Can you imagine what it would have been like if we'd had social media when Photoshop first came out? Oh my God, you could Photoshop yourself next to the president. People wouldn't be able to tell. Well, some people you could tell, some people you couldn't tell. How good is the digital artist who's doing the photoshopping now? So, this is a big technology to manipulate images. It's just going to continue to be more and more. And that's why I say I don't think it's really going to hurt the good artists because you still got to have that concept in your head. And you go, okay, here's the image I want to do. Here's how I want to present it. It's like you're talking about the presentation of type. You got color composition, you've got light and shadow, and how you want to control the reader's eye so they look at what you're wanting them to look at, where you don't put too much detail on the other stuff that you're just wanting to tunnel the vision where you want it to go. So yeah, there's a lot of technology in there. Now, one thing you're talking about, amateurs and maybe an artist who just you got some little book. You got to consider some of these guys, they might not get $500 in sales on their book total. That might be a big sale for them.
Oh yeah,
They can't
exactly.
spend $500 on artwork, so they're looking for any kind of cheap alternative. And guess what? When you look at that stuff, usually you can tell, yeah. And that's another thing too. I've got like one customer says, "Give me all the number one comics that come out." Well, I don't get him every single number one comic that comes out because I don't want to waste his money. I mean, oh yeah, that's maybe a missed sale, but I don't want to burn this guy out by buying a lot of this junk. Well, I look at it, man, that's just complete amateur hack work. I'm not going to take his money for that. I don't even want to ship it to him. And so I'm looking, if it looks professional, if it looks well done, then I'll order it for him. But when I look at something, I say, man, yeah, they'll be lucky they go to a number two on this. I'm not going to take his money to send him a junk like that. And so, I'm looking at all this art all the time, covers, and I'm judging a book by their cover, like, how good a job did they do with their image? And then, of course, what's the description? I mean, there's some things you just, oh man, I've read that story a million times. Nobody wants to read that again. So
Mic
so
on.
many people just they repeat, and that's a big problem with the comic book industry right now. Is you got a lot of people who are just hack writers who are just telling the same story over and over again. Where the art in the comic book industry right now is maybe the best it's ever been. Now they're hiring artists from all around the world, and they don't pay them very well. That's why they're hiring them from around the world. But these guys are pretty talented, and so you have guys who were considered top-notch artists back in the '70s, '80s, even in the '90s. Now they're just average artists, and so the
Mm,
evolution of art has gotten so much better. But the stories, I've tried to read these things, and I can read all the comics I want for
just
free.
horrendous.
I don't find much I want to read. I just like I look at it, it's like, yeah, I'm out.
I
Yeah, go ahead.
recently picked up the Deja Thoris John Carter thing that they're doing, and it was absolutely like the best cover I've ever seen. Luscious,
Good
sexy,
cover.
like it's Deja Thoris. Deja Thoris, you gotta understand, Deja Thoris is a complete smoke show. She's fantastic.
Most beautiful in the world.
Most beautiful in all the solar system, and they got it right. So I'm like, okay, picked it up. It's immediately like reading Steven Universe. The story is garbage. The dialogue is garbage. Like
Yeah.
if somebody was like, let's say do a publishing thing, and if one of my what's the term I want to use? If one of my horses, gave me that script, I'd have him shot behind the shed.
Come out
This
here for
is
free.
this is unacceptable. Like the editor, like I don't even blame the author for some of these things at this point. Like the editor, like said, yeah, good, print. And to me it's like I almost want to like find another copy of it just to write down the name to make sure I never work with this person in the future.
Yeah, it's
Mic
rough stuff
off.
on those. And I had bought them all because I was a Burroughs collector, and and I always knew I wanted to do a chronology one day, but I never read them. They didn't appeal to me at all. But then when I did that chronology, I wrote a synopsis for every comic that was ever made. Oh my God, some of those things were tough to get through. And I mean, they completely lost all depiction of Deja Thoris. Now, I realize that, the original Deja Thoris, as Edgar Burroughs wrote her, was the mate, damsel in distress. So she got kidnapped by this guy. Then she got kidnapped by that guy. Now this other guy came over and kidnapped her. I mean, she was just like a pawn on the chessboard, and everybody's running around trying to rescue her the whole time. So she was very one dimensional. So you want to see an evolution of the character grow, but the way they grew her, I just, I mean, almost porn images, from the camera angles they would choose to show her. But what was worse is they turned her bloodthirsty. I mean, there's one issue where there's a guy who did bombing on Helium. That's the capital of on Mars, and so she captures the guy, and she's cutting off fingers to get information so she can try to figure out who's behind it all. She's mutilating the guy and cutting off his fingers. So it's like, man, and they had one cover shows her with a bloody blade, and she's got a grim look on her face. Like, yeah, they're showing her thirsty for blood and looking for more. Just that wasn't Dacia Thoris. Dacia Thoris was a beautiful woman. Yeah, she was a damsel in distress, and you could do more with her. And they did more with her in the TV show, but they didn't turn her bloodthirsty where she's cutting people up into pieces. Yeah, I just don't completely agree with it. Now, I do kind of take it kind of personal how people do on their depictions and stuff. Like I used to be friends with Danton Burroughs, Edgar Rice Burroughs' grandson. Now, this is before I ever did my chronologies or anything like that. But I did a line of comics and novels called Wild Stars, and Dan had read them. He really liked them, and he had this one fragment of a story that Burroughs had started and he didn't complete. And there's what people thought was a problem of why they couldn't complete it, because he'd offered a lot of big name writers who are like, I just don't know what to do with it. Well, he told me about it, I was like, I know exactly what I want to do with it. And so Dad had me write it up. And then he's like, oh, well, by the way, Valentine's got all the book rights. Dark Horse has got all the comic rights. We don't know where we can publish it now. Well, then he died tragically. Poor Danton Burroughs. I mean, this is one of the most terrible stories. He had Parkinson's, so he was not a well man. And he worked for his grandfather's company, Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc., his entire life, worked his way up. And the day he became president of the company, that night there's a fire in the Tarzana headquarters where his dad, who was John Coleman Burroughs, who painted a lot of the covers for the Burroughs books, had a lot of his original oil paintings on the wall, got burned up in the fire. That night he has a heart attack and dies.
Mic on.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and
Mic off.
I used to be friends with people out there at Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. So all of a sudden I just lost all contact because that was just too tragic. So I lost all connection. Well, I write a lot about the Burroughs stuff, and I've done some pages on my website. And one thing that has never ever been really covered in America, except maybe one article in an old Comic Buyer's Guide issue, like way back 30 years ago or 40 years ago, about the British comics. And no other information has ever been available on it in America. And so I thought, well, I'm going to buy these things. That's pretty cool stuff. And so, and I wrote up a web page talking about all these UK comics and Tarzan, put it up on my website, and I got to thinking, I always wanted to do this thing called the chronology. Man, this my perfect pitch right here. Like, this is what I want to do. This is an example of it. So I sent out a solicitation to a publisher. I thought, yeah, I get my rejection a couple of weeks. Bam, the next day they were calling me wanting to work a deal. They said, you got to get permission from Burroughs people. I'm like, well, Dan's dead. I don't know anybody out there. I knew the numbers to call, so I went ahead and called. Got a hold of Jim Solis, who was the guy who's running the company. He was supposed to, run it in assistance with Danton. Then when Danton died, well, Jim Solis took it over and ran it. And so he's, what anybody would do when somebody's calling him up out of the blue, and he's like, "Who are you? What is this you want to do?" And he's giving me the time, but he's got like very incredulous. I said, "Well, I just put this page up on my website a couple days ago, and he'd already read it." He's like, "You did that?" We had a deal before the phone call was done, and I ended up going with a different publisher, and but working with him on that, and that relationship that we've built since then has led to other things. We do in the online Beyond the Farthest Star Strip. But as we're getting this thing ready to go to print, I was like, hey, why don't you guys let me do anything with this young Tarzan story? Well, he didn't know what I was talking about because it just wasn't there at the offices. At that time, we thought it had gotten burned up in the fire, the original manuscript, handwritten thing that Burroughs had written out, because what Danton sent me was something where somebody else transcribed it and sent it to me. Well, it turned out later that another fellow who runs their website for them had that original manuscript. Well, they didn't know anything about it at Edgar Rice Burroughs, so they thought I was talking about a story I wrote. They're like, yeah, go ahead and do it. And then we were talking about the pay rates, and I was like, yeah, we need to split it 50-50. No, you need to take 75-25. No. I mean, then finally, on the day we're doing the contract, they realized that was half written by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So we already had the rates agreed upon there because I wasn't being greedy. It's like, no, I can't take that much. And so it got published and by Krasova, and it's Young Tarzan and the Mysterious She. Now, we were talking about how people write, and what's interesting about this is almost everybody who reads it thinks the part that I wrote is the part Burroughs wrote, and the part Burroughs wrote is the part I wrote. So I guess you could say I aped his style, and but I was trying to write it like him, and I found a good workaround solution. I've only ever got one negative review by a guy who obviously didn't read it because he was making the assumption there was a conflict about Jane was the first blonde-haired woman he ever saw. But the story opened up with Tarzan hearing about, hey, there's this blonde captive over at the native village. And that was the conundrum that the other writers didn't know what to do. But I came up with a solution that still kept it in canon. And well, there's one guy who wrote a review about how dare he break canon because Jane was, I kept it that way. Didn't you even read the story? So don't you hate when people write a review and they don't even bother to read your story? But that's me just being faithful
Mic
to the writing
on.
of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Nice.
Yeah, Edgar Rice. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ben. You go
Oh,
first.
I was just saying, Edgar Rice Burroughs is one of the more not maligned, but how do I want to put it? Like, his work is
The
much.
establishment hates him.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And so seeing people actually working on his stuff, uh, it's like, as weird as it sounds, I actually quite enjoyed it. The John Carter movie, which I think was absolutely one of the most horrendous advertisements
Yeah,
we had ever seen.
yeah.
Even though, everyone knew what it was, right? Like anyone who
Yeah, I
has
had customers come in and go, well, why don't they, use the why are they using the doctor's name from ER? Why doesn't the actor who played him, the John
right.
Carter guy in ER, why isn't he playing the role? Like, that's not what the movie's about.
Yep.
They just went with John Carter, and a lot of people saw that and they thought, well, they didn't even realize it was on Mars. And then when they did see the stuff, they thought, oh, well, is this Cowboys versus Aliens Part Two? No, that's not it either. So yeah,
Ooh.
it was. Like you said, it was very poorly advertised.
Yep.
That's one of the great advantages I've had with 40 years of retail with multiple stores is getting all the interaction with the people, seeing what works, what doesn't work, talking to my customers, and and a lot of that got into my different books there too, because I'll be talking about things that they got right, things that got wrong. Where like on the new Robert E. Howard chronology, there was a series where they didn't even finish it called Call Eternal. Well, people looked at it and said, "Oh, they just made him into like a Highlander. He's like an eternal warrior." No, he was doing time travel, but they just didn't explain that. And everybody thought, oh, he's an eternal warrior because they had the eternal in there. And you gotta get the message across about what you're doing. And that series was never even completed. That was done by IDW and completely bombed. So advertising, you got to get the message out of it. What is you're selling, which is kind of what I'm trying to do here with Skydance right now, with y'all's help.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, what I was going to say is Burroughs has never been just personally a favorite of mine, but I've had an experience that's a little similar to yours when you were talking about like Deja Oris that Ben will know because I brought up before. But we're both fans. I don't know if you know the author John C. Wright. Maybe because you run in our circles, you might.
Yeah, not familiar with him, no.
So John C. Wright wrote a whole thing against The Last Jedi, the Star Wars movie. He was a Star Wars fan. And he wrote a thing and he just hated it. And he wrote a whole review on why it was terrible and why he hated it and all of that stuff. Uh, and that's neither here nor there for me. But I've always said to him that my Last Jedi was the Prince Caspian Narnia movie. So you know Chronicles of Narnia at all?
I saw the movies. I never read the books.
I see. So I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. Rice Burroughs, like I said, it's not that I have anything particularly against him. It's neither here nor there for me. But I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I read the Narnia books, and I liked the first movie. Thought it was fine. In retrospect, I actually think I overrated it. I think that I missed things that were really not that good. But at the time, I liked it. So Prince Caspian, the sequel to it, came out and I watched it and I was like, that was unbelievably bad. I hated every moment of it. And they go, why? And I said, okay, this is the main thing for me. There is a character in this story, and this is what your Deja Thora story reminded me of. In the books, and even in the first movie, they specifically say this. Her name, she's Susan, and she is known as Queen Susan the Gentle. That's her thing. Like, that's her title, right? Even the first movie goes out of its way to call her this Queen Susan the Gentle.
Hmm.
So, in the books, as they further characterize her, we see at one point they bring up that a war might occur, and Susan bursts into tears because she's so horrified by the idea that violence might break out. She is the only one of the four kings and queens of Narnia that doesn't go to war. And in Prince Caspian, they have her running into the middle of a battle with her bow and arrow, stabbing people in the chest with it. I said, first off, I just want to go into what sort of king sends their archers into the middle of a battle. That doesn't make even the slightest bit of sense.
An
Yeah.
English king. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Uh,
Kind of like that
I
sequel to
said, and
300.
why is Queen Susan in the middle of a battle, and why is she stabbing people? when her title is Queen Susan the Gentle, and the movie went out of its way to say it. I'm like, it made me so angry. I could not believe that they did that. And your story with Deja Thoris just
Yeah.
vividly reminded me with that. And it's similar too. It's not as if Susan was the most popular of the Narnia characters either. She's probably the least popular of the four children characters. And there are certainly ways I think that in a full length movie, if you wanted to expand upon some of the story, you might be able to. But going in a way that is the exact polar opposite of how she is explicitly described is not the way to go.
You got to maintain the faithfulness of character. Yeah, for sure.
Right, exactly. There's a difference between a growth or an evolution in a character or even an expansion in a way that makes sense and that builds on what the author had intended from before and character assassination. And
Yeah.
for my money, what they were doing with Susan was not in any way, shape, or form an extension of the character. It was character assassination.
Oh yeah, DC Comics kind of did that with Green Lantern. They had a big storyline going, and so one month you've got Superman saying about Green Lantern, he's the noblest of us all. Then the next month, all of a sudden, City gets blown up. Iris, his love of his life, gets killed. Then he starts killing all his friends. Like, oh, he's the noblest of us all, but don't give him any bad news. He'll go psycho, kill all his friends. And they left it like that for a long time. And then later, Jeff Johns comes along, retrocons say, oh, well, no, he's infected by this other entity called Parallax. That really wasn't Green Lantern. So it took several years, but he wrote his way out of it. And then Green Lantern became a popular character again. But they just totally destroyed that character for a while. You got to be faithful to who the character is, and you don't have but give him any bad news, he's going to turn into a psycho killer and start butchering his friends. Like,
Yeah, and it's one of those things too. Like I noticed that the solution that they came up with was kind of the comic book equivalent of it was all just a dream. But the flip side of this is that it takes a certain humility to see that you have brought this character in the wrong direction. You need to back out. And it's something that I've noticed in modern works. This sort of humility is totally lacking.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
it does not matter how negative the reaction to a character is. It does not matter how much the fans have indicated they hate it. There is a very, this attitude from authors where it's like, you know what? It's our work. We've decided this is how it's going to be. And then it's like, yeah, you don't. And I've even seen people say, like, good for them. You shouldn't let the audience dictate work of art. And I'm like, see, though, that's not how it's historically been, though. Like,
yeah,
in the past, if a character did things that were really unpopular with an audience, it got retconned.
yeah,
Now, I'm not saying you should always do that in every circumstance, and also if you have a plan and you believe in your writing, then you should stick to your plan. Sometimes you'll make your characters do something, people won't like it in the moment, but then you'll have a long-term goal, right, for where you're going with it, and you go, no, just stick with it. But like, good example of this, Luke Skywalker. Again, this is just a really easy one. In The Last Jedi, how I'm not even the world's biggest Star Wars fan either. I've enjoyed the movies well enough; they're fine, yeah. But they completely destroyed his character in The Last Jedi, and in a way that people argue that we don't. He's been gone for so many years. We don't know what happens, but there's a certain point where you go, everybody hates this though. Like, you got to recognize eventually that you have made a wrong step somewhere. People don't like the direction that you took this character. And in the sequel movie where they fired that director, by the way, and brought back the original director, they do retcon it, but they retconned it because that director was not the original director. If you ask the original director about what he did in the movie, he absolutely refuses to admit he did anything wrong, to the point where it's almost like a badge of honor for him. He's like, nope. He goes, I remember seeing an interview where they asked him, do you think any of the criticisms leveled against your movie might have been fair? And he said, no, absolutely not. And it's like,
wow,
that's just an insane thing to say. It's
yeah,
even
Yeah.
like, he goes, oh, this is one of the most divisive Star Wars movies. And he goes, well, I wanted it to be divisive. But the problem with this is that Star Wars was originally popular among everyone. So by saying it's divisive, what you actually did was cut out 50% of the audience. And then you say,
Yeah.
this is what I wanted to do all along. It's like, and I guess you've just made a really bad business decision.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Talk with my customers. People did not like those last Star Wars movies. Didn't like them at all. And I have to agree with them.
There
yeah,
was
and
thinking of like authors not, and writers and script writers and so on not liking their work. Like there's to me an even bigger danger of just like ignoring what your characters are doing in exchange for like 5 seconds of drama. Like there was this one scene, I used to enjoy Steven Universe, and there's this one scene where a character transforms into a dude's dead wife to mentally torment him, and his son and the son, the Steven, sees it, and it's completely ignored. It's like, well, I helped you cleaned up, so that's enough of a sorry. It's like, no, you transformed into his dead mother to mentally torment his father, his only living relative.
Wow.
Like, and it was framed as a dramatic and horrible moment too. Like the authors knew what they were doing. Like Rian Johnson knew what he was doing. The people who are writing the Deja Thoris comic that I read knew what they were doing. Most of these editors, most of these people know what they're doing. They don't think they're evil for it, but you know, they know.
Well, and another thing too is they're not connected to the fans. That's one of the big advantages I had with, like I say, with my stores, and this is something that kind of reflects in my writing. Is I'm telling the stories that my customers said this is what I want to have happen. And I'd listen to what did they not like about different types of storytelling and technique, and make sure I don't repeat those mistakes. And so I try to give you things that you can connect with and enjoy. Give you the kind of challenges. And one thing too is my work is not predictable. I mean, because people don't want where you okay looks like one negative review got another on my Wild Stars. The guy said, "Well, after the first few pages, I had no idea what was going to happen next." I'm like, man, I don't want to write for that guy because he's so used to reading the same pablum over and over again that he's a new story that's not immediately predictable. He doesn't like it. Well, that's not the kind of reader I'm writing for. Now, are those people out there? Yeah, but I don't think that's who you should write for because one reviewer said that the great thing about my stories is you think you know where I'm going with it, and then I'll pull the rug out from underneath your feet in a very delightful way, because I'll throw you a curveball, set you up, and then I'll do something different. And I think people want stories that will surprise them and reward them for going on the ride and give them something, that they didn't expect.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's one of the big benefits of our circles that we tend not to
mhm.
desire the common set of events. The common story, and then he killed the dragon and then he got the girl and he got the gold. Like we like those stories, don't get me wrong. But when people go like, well, is that all they are? It's like, no, and if I was writing it, it'd be like this is a metaphor for a man, fighting against the evil of the world, which seeks to corrupt him and those around him. And it's only through, the slaying of the dragon, i.e., denying Satan, that, meaning is wrought and, the world and normal life may be returned to. And I'm sure that Anthony would write something more Catholic, and I'm sure you would write something that suits you as well.
Yeah, I'm going to throw some twists in there where you think you know what's going to happen, and then you'll be surprised about what does happen.
Of course.
Yeah, I'll say too. Ben and I had this discussion on a previous live stream. We were having it again earlier today, where we were saying that one of the problems that we kind of see with all of these modern stuff is that it does not take a lot to make fans happy when you have this desecration of these old properties is just really like even when you know what's going on, as I think Ben and I kind of do, where we go like, okay, so they're in the hands of people who are like who kind of hate the world, right, and hate the culture and want to destroy these things. Like we know it, yeah, right. We're,
Yeah.
Well,
we're up
there's
to
some
speed on
publishers who
that.
asked them to do that. Yeah, they wanted to break all
Hmm.
the rules and change everything, go
So
further. Yeah.
exactly, but it's still a very surreal thing to witness as I watch it and think to myself, but it's like it wouldn't even be that hard to make something good. And what I mean by this is, I mean something very specific. I don't mean to imply that when I look at something and I go, I could do better than that. I don't mean it in the sense that I'm such a good writer, I would be able to do better. I mean that I am at the point where I am competent in terms of storytelling. I could tell a story with a structure that is good and with consistent characterization. That itself is a learnable skill that is frankly not impossible to learn, right? It's not that hard. So when
Yeah.
I watch this stuff and I see you're not even getting like the basic elements right. And one of the good test cases of this, there are two that come to mind, and we were discussing it earlier today. One is the Mandalorian show. When you go back to Star Wars, now the Mandalorian show, that first season, I have no idea if you saw it. I saw some of
I've
it.
seen it. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I would give it like 7 of 10. You know, it's a fine show. I thought it was okay. It had
Yeah.
its moments. I enjoyed it. It was not at all great. You know, uh, but it was fine. The thing is, the fans ate it up, and they ate it up because it was just It was competently done. It was, they
A little
showed
bit
Luke
better than the
doing
movies.
something
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, Luke acted cool. He acted in character. He was like, that's literally all you need. And if that had been the level of Star Wars for the past 20 years, they would probably go, oh, yeah, it's not quite as good as the original trilogy, but nobody would complain about it. The other one was from Marvel. When we were looking at the latest Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, Marvel, this latest few Marvel movies, I don't know how big of a fan you are or not of the franchise as a whole, but I liked it when it was in its prime. This latest phase of Marvel has been like unreal levels of bad. Like, so bad it is like insane to witness them destroy this incredible cash cow franchise that they have just run it into the ground, like in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. And one of the movies that came out in this phase was Spider-Man No Way Home. And No Way Home was notable because it was really good. It's the only really good property, really, in the entire Phase 4 of Marvel, I would wager, right?
Well,
And
it was enjoyable seeing all the other Spider-Mans being brought together into a collage.
yeah, and one of the reasons it was good, though, was like, it made me kind of angry to watch because I'm like, the decisions they made that made this good are so simple, like that they're really not hard. One of the big things was that Peter's love interest in those new movies, I hated her in the first two films. I found her very unpleasant. I didn't think that they had good chemistry, and I was like, I just really, really dislike that they call this character MJ because she's nothing at all like who MJ is supposed to be. But in No Way Home, what blew my mind was that just with these very simple decisions they made, by the end of the movie, I was actually really invested in their relationship. And the decisions were things that were like, she supports Peter. Peter says, I have to do this dangerous thing. And she says, go ahead, do it. I'll be here waiting for you. Peter is struggling. She says, we need to find him. We need to help him. Peter is going to do this. She backs him up on it. She doesn't abandon him. And it's like, that's it. That's all it took. You didn't need to radically change the character. You didn't need to do something crazy with this character. Like, you didn't need to give her a big hero moment. She doesn't get one, really.
They
She
didn't
doesn't
make
get
her
a hero moment.
dysfunctional. Yeah.
Yeah, but she is supportive of the person that she loves, and that makes her likable.
Hmm.
So that by the end of the movie, when Peter has to go, he needs to make the choice that he's going to give up MJ, it actually meant something because I liked their relationship. And I was like kind of angry about it because I'm like, you could have done this from the first movie. You could have done this all along. And now that you needed to make a hit, as I'm looking at our comments, Bradford Walker says No Way Home was a Sony corporation. Sony wouldn't let Marvel and Disney damage the brand. Yeah, that seems about right to me. I feel as if Sony must have stepped in and said, make a good movie. Yeah, right? Like,
Well,
do it right.
one of the things they did well with those series was casting for the new Aunt May, because one thing you've never ever heard in the whole history of Spider-Man comics were the phrase "Aunt May is hot."
And then Marissa Tomei came in.
Yeah, and then everybody's like, "Hey, May, yeah, she's kind of hot." Yeah, everybody loved Marissa Tomei, and then they killed her in the last movie, which that was one thing people didn't like. Why do you have to kill off characters when you're done with them?
Yeah, Bradford Walker also says this about The Mandalorian. He says The Mandalorian hit big because it was journeyman quality work that affirmed fan norms after a long series of outright insults incompetently done. He's absolutely right. It is journeyman, like, I think, I don't mean to give the impression that at least season one, I haven't even seen past that, and I haven't seen all of season one, but it was not, when I say journeyman, I don't mean that to mean bad. I don't think it was bad. Uh, that's my point. I think though that it was fine, right? Like, and to be honest, if The Mandalorian was not a Star Wars brand and I just watched it, I'd probably give it a fairly lukewarm recommendation. Like, oh, you should, if you like space westerns, you might want to check this out. It's not bad. That
Hmm.
would probably be how I'd put it. I don't think it was bad, right? Like, it's a fun new show. Maybe it could go somewhere one day, right? But the fact that it was Star Wars, like, this is what I mean. They have this brand where literally that's all they need to do is journeyman quality work, and fans will eat it up, and they're not doing it. Like, and it's not, Star Wars has been the representative example that I've been using, but Edgar Rice Burroughs is another one. And Edgar Rice Burroughs has been so thoroughly beaten into the ground and destroyed that it's no longer even really a moneymaker. And to say that nowadays, I don't think that would shock most people. But when you look at the history of it, that would have been an insane comment to make back in its heyday. Like, Edgar Rice Burroughs, not a moneymaker? Like, that's almost impossible to fathom if you're looking at it from his heyday. They would be like, that doesn't even make sense. That's impossible.
Yeah, it just they make decisions sometimes, and you're just like, what are they thinking, and why are they thinking that? I mean, just they just lose the concept of the characters, and it's like you were talking about the relationship with Spider-Man and Mary Jane, and I remember one of my favorite comics when I was young was Magnus Robot Fighter, had a solid relationship with Senator Kane's daughter Leisha, and very solid. Well, then the modern publishers get a hold of it. Now she starts sleeping with his friends and having babies by him. And I mean, everything was completely dysfunctional, and you can't relate to it anymore. And I watched Superman as a brand of a comic totally get destroyed in my stores. That used to be such a solid seller. With great power comes great responsibility was always the mantra. I used to have all these different police officers, people at the district attorney's office, things like that. All these guys in authority would buy it, military guys. Boy, last few years, not one person in the military or the police force buys that product anymore. I mean, because people just couldn't relate to it anymore because it became so dysfunctional. And like they brought Gwen Stacy back, the death of Gwen Stacy was something that just hurt so many fans. We always loved Gwen Stacy, wanted them to be a couple, and she died. Well, then they bring her back, and guess what? She was having babies by the Green a Goblin. Like what? They totally destroy the characters, and then they wonder why the sales slump. You got to give the fans what they want. Yeah, you it's your characters. You can do what you want to with them, but you want the fans to kind of take ownership of what you create, be invested
Hmm.
in it. And when you abandon them and give, like I don't recognize this character more, you're not interested. It's like I'll try to watch different programs, and I'll be out like an episode or two because I'm not invested in the characters. There's none of the characters I like. I don't care what happens to them, so I quit watching. And that's what happens with your other kind of creations in comics and like that. When you stop caring about the characters, you're gone. You lose your readership.
This happened with Spider-Man relatively recently. Nowadays, I think like it would actually be almost 10 years ago, though I might be remembering the dates wrong. But the infamous, what was it called? One Day More, One More Day saga,
Oh yeah,
where they retcon his marriage to MJ. Uh,
that was
and
awful.
I remember when this happened. I've never read, I think I've read like one or two Spider Man comics ever. I like the character and I like the movies, right? But I'm not really a fan of the comics. But I remember when this came out, fans were so upset. And they still are to this day. There are
Oh yeah,
fans
they
who
are,
are like, they won't forgive Marvel for retconning that marriage. I
and
was
they're just
talking to
gonna get rid of
someone
it. Yeah.
today, and I mentioned, he mentioned something like, I really love his marriage with Aunt May, and they retcon that, and he like cursed out Marvel. He just started cursing cursing them out, and he's like,
Well,
no,
it was such a lame plan because they wanted him to be single.
mm-hmm.
So, but editor Joe Quesada is like, it's immoral to get a divorce. So it'd be better to make a deal with the devil instead. Like, wait a minute, getting a divorce is immoral. Deal with the devil? That's okay. Come on, people. What are you talking about? It made no sense. They had another plan when Michael J. Straczynski, the guy who wrote Babylon 5 and Jeremiah, a whole lot of different TV shows, he was writing Spider Man. And they said they was leaked to us as a joke, but I think it was kind of using the retailers as a test market. And thank goodness they did because they had a plan where they were going to completely retcon Spider Man's origin. They were going to make it to where Uncle Ben molested him as a child. I just would have destroyed
Mic
the
on.
character. I mean, the whole thing was like when Uncle Ben.
What?
I know that was our reaction, and when Uncle Ben died, they've been like, "Oh, hey, got what he deserved." Instead of like, "Oh, I've got to avenge Uncle Ben," I've got to be a better man because what happened to him, because I didn't, stop that burglar when I could have, and he killed Uncle Ben after that. Instead it'd be like, that pervert got what he needed, So yeah, and everybody just the reaction was so bad. They're like, "No, no, we weren't serious. That was a joke we leaked." Yeah, thank God they didn't do it because they've destroyed it so bad in so many other ways. People just don't connect to it. And telling a good story and keeping people invested. Sometimes nowadays it's like all the big movements, like when somebody gets murdered, somebody gets killed, a woman gets raped. They just do the really obvious major things. But there's so many subtle things you can do to really build the character and build the story and get the reader invested in it. I remember there was one issue of Spectacular Spider-Man opening page. This is while he's still single, hasn't gotten into a really hard relationship with Mary Jane yet, but he's still in a relationship with him. She's got a key to his apartment, and she uses to unlock it. Well, she opens up the door, and there's Spider-Man. Well, he's got this other girl in his apartment complex who's throwing herself at him. He's really not responding, but when Mary Jane opens the door, well, she just sees this girl all over him, and the caption read, "As a spectacular Spider-Man, Peter Parker has been in many, much more dangerous situations than this. But right now, he can't remember one of them." I just loved it. I mean, I thought, that's gets you that characterization. Like, wait a minute, that's the girl I really care about, and she's thinking I'm fooling around with this girl, which I'm not, but it looks like I am. And I love that characterization. You don't get that kind of nuance anymore. You get great artwork, but you don't get the storytelling like you used to.
Yeah, and I'll also note that even with some of the artwork, there's a style became big relatively recently, and I say relatively recently. It's probably been about a decade now, right? You are you familiar with the term cal arts?
Not really.
So, it's a thing that's big in children's animation.
Okay.
And it's not all, and I will hasten to add that is a style. It's not always bad. There are shows that I like with the style, but it's sort of a simplified chibi-esque style. Uh, it's used in Ben mentioned Steven Universe, Gravity Falls. In the modern day, I just know that the show is on now, even though I don't watch any of it. But Big City Greens is a show that's out in the modern day that uses this sort of kind of chibi-esque, very chubby, very rounded features, very broad strokes artwork. And again, not all of it's bad, right? Like Gravity Falls in its heyday had was a good show that had some good animation and good artwork in it at times, but it started to dominate children's animation in a really, really obnoxious way. And then it did start making its way into comics. If you look up Nolan North who is the writer of a series of dinosaur based comics. He was known just as like a web comic artist. He did very, very simple stuff. Well, he was hired, I think, by Marvel. It was by Marvel, yeah, to do a series on the spectacular Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl was a gag character created by Steve Ditko for a one shot. However, she became notable because in her gag appearance, she defeated Doctor Doom. Right? Uh, and it was canon, like it was a joke comic, but it was technically canon. And most of the time, when Doctor Doom is defeated, if they decide that they think that puts the character's power level too high, they make it a clone. But because Ditko only ever intended this to be a gag comic and a one-time use character, he never bothered indicating that that was a Doctor Doom clone. So officially in the Marvel canon, Squirrel Girl is one of the only people to ever actually defeat Doctor Doom. Well, like 20 years later, somebody picked up on this, right? and they thought it was funny, and they gave a comic to the Spectacular Squirrel Girl. Now the problem is, I have seen some of the art and the jokes from the modern Squirrel Girl comics. It's awful, like really, really bad, and they use that Cal Art style. Only it's very simplified and very ugly. Uh, and the joke, like the writing, is just so bad. They make it very meta and self-aware, and they make the character, you know, I don't really know what else to say, but they make her a Mary Sue. Like they make she can't do anything wrong. She, she'll do these things that are horrible that the narrative won't call her out on. Like there's so many issues here with how they're writing this character. It's like this should be this is a fun concept for a gag story, right? Like this should be a perfectly fun book, and they just can't help themselves, you know. And I do see that very simplified CalArt style a lot, but you're right that there is a lot of good artwork as well. You know, I know that Rob Liefeld, who was the creator of Deadpool, he was kind of legendary. He came up in the '90s and was one of the founders of Image Comics, and he was kind of legendary for being a terrible artist.
Tiny heads, tiny feet,
Yep,
gigantic chests.
exactly, and lots of pouches.
Yeah.
You know, there was a famous article that went viral, like the 40 worst Rob Liefeld drawings, and I don't know, you're nodding, so you might have seen it. It went viral, and I read it was very funny. I don't know a thing about Liefeld. I've honestly heard conflicting things about him. I've heard from some people who have worked with him, oh, he's the nicest guy, and I've heard from other people that he's a jerk. So, with given conflicting information, I can only say no comment.
Yeah, I've
Uh,
never met him, so don't know anything about him.
yeah, but he was a famously bad artist, and yeah, I've seen people try and rehabilitate his image today, but having seen some of his artwork, even in context, I really can't agree. He was not good. Uh,
You know, me as a purchaser, I'd see his name like, okay, start cutting back on the orders. Liefield's on the book, and I could never drop my orders fast enough.
uh, so not a fan of the guy. I guess he did create Deadpool, and I do like some of the Deadpool stuff. So hey, credit where it's due. But uh,
Well, you know, the Deadpool we recognize as what's popular. That was a later incarnation when you had another
yeah,
guy, Fabian Nasenza, you know, really brought out who the character was. And I've only ever read, I think, really just one comic book. Well, actually, I don't think I even read the whole thing. Youngblood #1, when that came out from Image, that was a Liefeld book. And I opened it up, and you know, it's okay for women to support their guy, but sometimes they don't get the characterization right. And the story
Excuse me.
opened up with
Excuse me.
the one of the guys, I guess Shaft or
Mic
whatever from
off.
the Youngblood, and he's meeting his girl at the mall. He stood her up for like 3 dates in a row, and she's like, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I just got a call, I got to go," and she's like doing a cheerleader routine. Go get him again, you know, like come on, this guy's obviously never dated a real girl in real life. You just stood her up 3 times. You're about to stand her up a fourth time, and she's doing a cheerleader routine as you run off. I mean, this guy, you know, just come on, get the characterizations right. I was done. I didn't read anymore after that. That was the last time I tried to read Leafield there.
I also think it's very funny that Liefeld, from what I've seen, and this might be, it's possible this was a fake, but I've seen it going around. So take what I'm about to tell you with at least a little bit of a grain of salt, because maybe this isn't an authentic Liefeld quote. But I have seen him deny that Deadpool was based off of Deathstroke. Uh, and he goes no, and he said no, it's a total fantasy. And they're like, but the creator admitted it, and he said, I'm the creator, it's completely fantasy. Somebody goes, well, let's see, the design is identical. Wade Wilson instead of Slade Wilson, carries two pistols, carries two swords. They go, sure, yeah, no, you made it up. Right, totally original creation. And it's like, to be fair, like I said, I didn't even see the original tweet, so it's possible that somebody else made that and then started spreading it around, you know. So I don't mean to drag Rob Liefeld through the mud here, right? However, I find it very hard to believe that Deadpool was not originally based off of Deathstroke. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's true too that there are characters who get popular in later incarnations. Like my favorite version of this is Daredevil, right? Frank Miller, the version of Daredevil that we all know is Frank Miller's creation. 100% Frank Miller's creation. Now, I consider Frank Miller a genius. I know that he famously or infamously went downhill after 9/11, and he's admitted as much. He said that 9/11 like really affected him mentally, and you could tell in some of the comics and things like that. Uh,
Now I've actually met Frank Miller, so yeah, I know a little bit about him as a person. There, not not real well. I was on a cruise that he was on, a comic book legal defense fund cruise, and it was kind of great because it was all these people who were worked in the industry. I was like the only retailer, so I was like the most popular guy on the cruise because there was like, how do I sell my book in your store? And so I got a chance to talk to all these different guys, have dinner with them, and Will, have dinner with Will Eisner and people like that. So it was a fantastic cruise. I met so many people on that thing, and I was drinking and beer and talking with Frank Miller, and I realized I'm talking to Frank Miller and I'm drinking Miller Lite. Oh, it seemed weird at the time.
yeah, Miller. Like I've always been a fan of Miller, of classic Miller. Daredevil Born Again is my favorite comic book ever, and it still is to this day. I think it's just a masterpiece. And interestingly, I was a fan of his incarnation of Daredevil, and I looked into the history of it one day, and I
Uh-huh.
knew that Daredevil was invented by Lee and Ditko. So I read Daredevil #1, the Lee. It was Ditko, I think. I think it was. Yeah, Lee anyway. And I read Daredevil #1, and I was kind of blown away by the fact that it was terrible. And Daredevil #1 was really bad. Now, in fairness, the artwork in Daredevil #1 was excellent. No, you can't fault the artwork of it. But the writing of Daredevil 1 was really bad. And this was considered like one of the best stories of the Lee Ditko era, right? Of Daredevil, like their first issue. Because you could see once you actually read the issue, and especially with all of the ads that they throw in it, it is meant to be a clone of Spider Man. Very explicitly, Daredevil is meant to be another version of Spider Man. And they could not possibly make it more explicit if they tried. The issue is just packed with ads like from the creator of Spider Man. If you like Spider Man, you'll like this, you know. And then you go through the beats of Daredevil's original origins, and they kind of match Spider Man's one for one, right? Like, you would go, okay, so you have this character, his father is killed, he goes to hunt them down, and then the person he goes to hunt dies, but he doesn't die from, like, he's not killed by them. However, he dies as a result of being chased by them. And there are just some really, really baffling writing decisions in that Daredevil #1. Like the fact that he realizes he has these powers, and after his father is killed, he goes in to fight a group of gangsters, and he wins the fight with the gangsters, of course, because he's Daredevil, which that I don't have an issue with. But he actually says mid-fight, it's true, my powers do give me superhuman reflexes or something. So I'm like, wait a minute, you went into this fight without realizing that? Like, you've never tested this before, so you're going up against multiple armed men at once, just on the off chance that you have superpowers.
Well, have you ever heard the term Marvel Zombie?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, that shows you how much the market's changed. Back like in the '80s and even into the early '90s, there was a term called Marvel Zombies. That meant these were people who would buy anything Marvel. They were just Marvel. Is there a Marvel on the rack? I'm buying it. Is a new Marvel #1? I'm buying it. And Marvel still operates like those people exist anymore, but they killed them off with variant covers and junk #1s and constantly relaunching. But Frank Miller had a lot to do with why there were Marvel zombies there for a while because I couldn't tell you how many customers in my store told me they quit buying Daredevil. They just said, "That's it, I'm done." The month before Frank took it over, and that's when it started getting good because he started doing better stories and he had that great Klaus Johnson inks on his work, and he made Daredevil relevant. And he had great stories, and the character had depth. The Elektra story, that was a tragic story. She was a great character. They killed her off, then they brought her back, and but Frank really did a good job on that. With Frank, it's kind of like I was talking about that comic book Legal Defense Fund cruise. There's a story I talk about editors and dealing with editors, and how you were talking earlier about how the editors make a lot of bad decisions. And I was watching all these different people showing their art portfolios. And if you haven't done anything or haven't been accomplished or had a success in the industry, oh, this is shit. This is shit. This is shit. Frank Miller could draw a picture of a dog turd. They'd be like, "Oh my God, it's the greatest masterpiece we've ever seen." So he wasn't getting good feedback on his work. It's like everything he did, it's great, it's fantastic, you can't do no wrong. Where a person could draw the Sistine Chapel in perfect 3 point perspective, it's dog shit. Yeah, so the editors, they're just based on what was your last thing that you did. Oh, you haven't done the last thing. Well, then you must not have any talent. So I was watching a lot of that happen, and but yeah, Frank, he really had a lot to do with Marvel Zombies. I couldn't tell you how many people dropped off right before he took it over, and now they're like after that for a long time they're like, I'm going to stick with it because I know the next issue is going to get better. If I drop off the book now, I'll miss the next issue. That's when it's going to get good. So that was kind
Yeah,
of
Miller single-handedly saved Daredevil from cancellation. Like,
definitely.
it's a well-known story. He took over Daredevil. According to him, this is how he tells it, as a challenge, because he said his superpower was that he was blind. He goes, and he took some aspects of the character that were there, but were kind of like underutilized or in the background. Like Daredevil, they had established that Matt Murdock was Catholic, and it was Miller, who was a former Catholic, I think, who picked up on this and said, I, of course, I started to push this because to me, only a Catholic could be a vigilante and a lawyer, which is a great line, I say as a Catholic, right? Uh, so it's a great line. And he says, so I started pushing this aspect of the character. And, previous writers had moved it into a noirish direction, but Miller really started pushing that aspect of it. And he grew his relationship. And he brought Daredevil back from the dead. It was a bi-monthly release that was on the verge of cancellation that he turned into one of Marvel's most popular comics within less than a year. Yeah,
Mhm.
which is really just if you think about that, like that's an unbelievable feat considering how few issues were released. People must have noticed how it going up right very quickly. And then of course he left and came back and teamed up with Mazzucchelli, who ever since Born Again has been one of my favorite artists to do the Born Again run, which I think is Miller's best work.
I do too. Yeah,
Born,
that was great stuff.
yeah, it's really a really really beautiful story. Uh, it's I'm trying to think of how to put. Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Lots of Christ imagery in it. Lots of symbolism. Also, one of my favorite single issues of a comic ever. I can't remember the number, but it's the storyline. It's the issue where Matt returns, and everything comes to a head. Ben Urich runs in. His wife is hanging, and Matt shows up, and Karen and Foggy are hiding out in her apartment, and Karen decides she's going to walk outside and sacrifice herself to save Foggy's life. And then Matt shows up to rescue them. And it all culminates in this really beautiful two-page spread of Karen collapsing into Matt's arms and sobbing. Uh, well, always been one of my favorites. And then famously, he adds the thing with Nuke at the end of it, and everybody says, it's not quite as good. And I agree, but I think comparatively, it's not quite as good. I think the stuff with Nuke is it's good. I don't think it's bad writing exactly. I just think it came off of some of the best comic book writing probably ever. So it looks a little off in comparison. Uh, they start to bring a few of the other Avengers into the story, and it had been a very personal story up to that point, so it didn't ring quite as true. But I think there was good stuff in it. He
Oh, the
brought in
story was fantastic. Yeah.
Mhm. So Miller's always been a favorite of mine for that reason. I liked the Dark Knight Returns. I thought was very good, which was a Miller story. He came out. I've had this conversation with Ben before, so I'd be curious to see what you think of it. He was considered one of like the big two of the era. Along it was Miller and Moore. Alan
Right.
Moore was the other one, and they kind of brought in the Bronze Age of comics. But I always considered them to be only superficially similar in a lot of ways because I thought that Moore was a subversive. That
Well,
was my.
here's what happened with both those guys. And now remember, I've been doing this as a retailer since '82. When I first started, every single thing I carried in my store was all ages material. And so it was always be funny. You get a call from a kid. He goes, "Hi, I'm the kid who was in your store last week. Remember, I'm the one who bought the comic book." I'm like, "Well, they all did." And so, but then along comes Frank Miller, along comes Alan Moore, and they started writing for a little bit more mature because with the direct market stores like mine, they didn't have to go through newsstand distribution. They could do a little bit edgier stuff, and guess what? They found out it sold really well. Now, initially, the Dark Knight was a bomb. I mean, when that first issue came out, it said on the shelves, people were like $3.95 for a comic. I'm not paying that. Then it got some good reviews, and bam, it just whooshed off the shelf, and then was a super hit from that point on. But just initially, just sitting on the shelf by itself before all the buzz started, nobody wanted to buy it because they just didn't want to pay the price. But now back up a little bit further, when I opened up in '82, um, I wanted to do things to make my stores unique. And with my printing background, what I was doing is back then they didn't do reprints, but there's no such thing as graphic novels. And so what I did, they were actually starting to do like deluxe reprints, like the New Gods, different things like that. And so I collected those. Shadow of the Bat, collected that, and then Frank Miller's new series called Ronin, the Crisis on Infinite Earths. I would take these runs, took them down to a local bookbindery, and had them bound in hardcover. And man, these things sold as fast as I could get them made. And but I was a little bit worried. I don't want to infringe on anybody's copyrights. So I went to a retailer convention up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I showed them to both Marvel's Carol Kalish. She was the representative in charge of the direct market. And I forget who the representative was for DC. And I asked them both the same question: am I going to, you guys going to get mad about this? Is this a problem? And they both said the same thing. They said, look, when you put them in a plastic bag, you're repackaging them. However you want to repackage it to sell in your store, we don't care. As long as you don't advertise it on the national market, you can do whatever you want. But then the next thing I asked them, both the same question, like, well, these things sell as fast as I can make them. Why aren't you guys doing it? And they both looked me straight in the eye and said, there will never be a market for reprint collections. Well, now go back to what we're talking about on The Dark Knight Returns and The Watchmen came out. They decided, well, hey, these did so well. Let's try those graphic novel collections. They are both still in print to this day. Now, the flip side, though, they weren't thinking about that when they did the contracts. I was talking to, Bob, I can't think of his last name. He was the editor of all the Batman comics through the 90s. And he was on that comic book League of Defensemen cruise. He was telling me that during the 90s, Frank Miller did no work at all for DC, but just from the royalties from the Dark Knight Returns, because he was getting paid first print money on that graphic novel, because there wasn't a clause in there for reprints, that he was getting so much money off just the sale of the Dark Knight Returns graphic novel that he was their highest paid freelancer throughout the 90s, just off of that one book. Well, it was the same thing with Alan Moore. However, I did a review of Alan Moore's exit interview where he's talking about why he didn't want to write for comics anymore. Alan didn't look at this as a half full cup of water. He looked at it as a half empty glass because he's like, well, I was supposed to get the rights back after it went out of print, and it's never gone out of print. I'm being ripped off. You're getting first print money. You could have gotten that deal if you asked for it, but it wasn't a deal he thought he was going to get. And he decided he was going to be mad about that forever. So, but so those two guys got sweetheart deals out of the deal. They're still in print today, and then now and graphic novels from that point on have been a huge part of our market. But that's where Frank Miller and Alan Moore kind of changed the market. But people looked at them both, and the common denominator they drew from them, hey, this is mature stuff. This is heavy violence type of stuff. That's in the market went from all ages material to all mature reader material, and and it was more immature reader because it just they were just throwing stuff in there and didn't even actually wasn't even needed to tell a story. But then they alienated and made it where I couldn't sell to a. I had to create a, younger reader section in my store. I didn't have an adults only section because I never carried X-rated books. I knew my market. And I knew that wouldn't fly. Later, they passed laws to say, well, you can't have that kind of stuff because you're too close to schools and churches. I'm like, well, fine. I'm already carrying it, so that's not a problem. At least then people didn't get mad because, well, how come you won't choose to carry this X-rated stuff I want? And so it actually kind of worked out to my advantage. But they just got that's what they got out of it. What Frank Miller and Alan Moore did, they did kind of heavy violence stuff. Oh, Mark, they want all violence from then on, and everything went to the mature readers, and they completely abandoned the all ages, which is how they grew the market.
Yeah, it's I think it's been a mixed bag on the overall industry. But what I was thinking is I've never liked Alan Moore, and I've always loved Frank Miller. With the caveat that Frank Miller hasn't really done a lot of great work since his heyday, right? Which I'll acknowledge, right? But Uh, I think that the two are often looked at that surface level. What's the common denominator? Well, they were very mature works, right? And that's how people see it.
Right.
And I think in many ways, though, that Miller and Moore really should not be grouped together like that because I think that they were very different stylistically. I look at Moore as a subversive, especially Watchmen. Watchmen was a subversive work. This is why Moore never really understood this fully about his own work, I think, or at least perhaps he did, but he was always dismayed that the fans were looking for it to be something more than that, and that's never what he intended. Because he always was bemoaned the fact that Rorschach was always the most popular character. The reason that Rorschach was the most popular character is that in Watchmen, everybody was a terrible person, but Rorschach stood for something, you know, and he stood for something that was very concrete and very very easy to hang your hat on, right?
He
Uh,
was the Wolverine of the book.
yeah, exactly. Now, that didn't necessarily mean he was a good person, but at the very least, he was a man with morals in a world with none. So naturally, readers would gravitate to him, and Moore always hated that, right? Because at the center of Watchmen, there really wasn't anything there, and that was the point of the story. You know, nothing mattered. Nothing ever was ever going to matter. These are all terrible people doing terrible things, and in the end, it doesn't really mean anything anyway. I don't think that that was ever Miller's goal, at least not with The Dark Knight Returns. Maybe in other works, but certainly Born Again. We're the superversive team, right? We're the opposite of subversive. We're about building up culture, and Born Again is one of the most superversive comic books ever created, because it tears Matt Murdock down to as low as you could possibly go, brings these characters, Karen and Matt, down to the very, very lowest that they possibly could be, and then it slowly builds them back up again
The
through
hero's
great,
journey.
yeah. And in the Dark Knight Returns too, I get the impression that people see it as sort of a kind with Watchmen, and I don't really agree with that. I don't think that The Dark Knight Returns is a subversive work. I think that it is a more mature take on Batman, certainly, because it's very dark. The Joker dies in it, which many, many people, in my opinion, misinterpret as Bruce kills the Joker, which is not what happens. He injures the Joker, and the Joker kills himself to make it look like Bruce kills the Joker. Uh, but he doesn't kill him, which many, many people I've noticed interpret as, oh, he killed, he's finally forced to kill the Joker, but he doesn't. That's the whole point. That's the Joker's last act when he could do nothing else is to kill himself to make Batman look like a murderer when he's not. But anyway, in The Dark Knight Returns, I always saw The Dark Knight Returns as ultimately a story that was uplifting, that Batman ultimately succeeds in his goals in the end. He manages to establish a essentially like a sort of interim police force in Gotham after the power goes out. He starts to reorganize the city. He fights back against the mutants and takes and sort of sort of ends the gang violence that's going on and points it towards a productive end. It's like I don't see this as a subversive work. It's not saying that Batman's pointless. It's asking the question is is Batman pointless, right? But I think that the answer that it ultimately comes to is no. You know, that Bruce is doing something that is real and meaningful in the story, right? And that Batman is doing something that is real and meaningful. And that's the opposite of Watchmen.
Yeah, Watchmen was very anti-establishment. Where of course Batman was a little bit Batman Returns was a little bit anti-establishment because you had Superman as the representative of the government, and just then Batman. That was actually the first time you actually saw Batman take Superman down. Ever since then, that's kind of like been part of it. Like Batman's got a plan to take everybody down, and that was when that was kind of first introduced as a concept about Batman having contingency plans like that. But yeah, it's they were just they were more mature. They were more in depth. They had more nuance in a lot of the comics that were being written at that time too. And so they really stood out. And of course, with the direct sale market, you weren't limited by the Comics Code Authority, so they gave them more carte blanche to do a little bit wider scope and a little richer canvas on the storytelling. Um, But like I say, the bad thing was that they just completely abandoned all ages after that. And yeah, just I remember there was one really bad issue of Fury, Nick Fury, and it was a huge seller when it started, but by the time that last issue came out, it wasn't selling at all because they went from mature just to be mature. Like there was a scene where Nick Fury walks into a room filled with women, and they all start screaming, "Oh, no more, Nick! We can't take no more!" Like he was having sex with so many women all at the same time that it came across more immature than mature.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah,
Uh,
Mic on.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
one
that's
of those
pretty
things.
immature.
yeah, it is.
Mic
People
off.
took the exact wrong lessons out of that whole era, right? They learned the wrong things, and I think in looking back on it in retrospect, I think it's a little bit more forgivable than the bad lessons of the modern era, because I think that the modern era is intentionally like they're almost not caring about if something is going to sell or not sell, and I do think that though the mistakes that were made back then were at the very least mistakes that were made in the direction of this is sellable, right? This is going to make us money. And that's not what I'm seeing nowadays. The mistakes that are being made now aren't even technically so called mistakes because I think they're intentional, right? It's
Yeah,
intentional subversion and intentional destruction of their properties where they're almost going like, and if it doesn't sell, well, too bad. We have a point to make and we're going to make it, whether they like it or not.
yeah. There's just certain things people don't want to be preached to, and that's what they've started doing. And you can have politics into things, but your agenda shouldn't just be where you're beating somebody over the head with a sledgehammer. And that's kind of what they've gotten to, and people just can't relate to it. It's like I said, Spider-Man
Mhm.
used to be noble. With great power comes great responsibility. When all of a sudden people didn't recognize him as a noble character anymore, it became all dysfunctional slacker. People lost interest, and so do you want to keep your readers or not? I've heard a lot talked about they don't want the old readers anymore. They just want the new readers. Like you don't alienate your customer base. I don't care.
Yeah,
You try to expand your customer base. You don't just say, oh, we're only going to focus on this one niche group, and that's the only people we're going to make stuff for. And that's one of the reasons why that was a factor when the pandemic hit. I'm like, I just don't see what the publishers are doing as anything to base this as a model to keep on making sacrifices on my time and my effort to keep 5,500
hmm
square foot of retail space going. This is an exit point. I had always had an exit strategy built. I was like, execute the plan because okay, all the reasons why I should give it up. Okay, here's the reasons why I shouldn't, and there was nothing in the shouldn't pile
and
because it was just like there's so many reasons. Like it's time to go. I'm just giving up on it because I
yeah, and it's
business partners who were Marvel and DC. I just didn't feel like they had my best interest at heart. They weren't giving me the product I needed to sell. So
You're
why
absolutely right.
waste
And
my
we've had
life?
this conversation before where we've said that part of the issue too is that people you'll hear people sometimes say it's common, comics just aren't selling, which is completely catastrophically wrong. Manga is enormously huge. It is bigger than it has ever been. It is dominating the market.
Uh huh.
European comics are doing incredibly well. So
Right.
the problem is not comics. It is not the medium of comics. The
It's Marvel
problem
DC
is,
just doing the same thing over and over again.
yeah, and if you learn from, we've had this, like, what can we learn from the manga market? Well, one of the things we can learn is that for all the criticisms they sometimes get, in my opinion, from people who don't really know what's going on there, that there's a lot of samey stuff. They have their shonen tropes and things, right? Anime type tropes. If you actually look through an issue of Shonen Jump, and that's another thing I'll mention in a moment of there, which is like the most popular magazine aimed towards boys, right? If you look through an issue of Shonen Jump, you will find like every genre in there. There are
Variety.
superhero stories. My Hero Academia is incredibly popular. It's the third most popular manga in the world right now, which makes it probably in the top 5 of all comics. Uh, and there's One Punch Man, which is another kind of superhero parody type comic. But there's also like there's sports. There are comics that are just entirely based around sports. We're reading like this Victorian sci-fi thriller that's like Blade Runner, but
Yeah.
and this just came out. Like all of these different ideas. A story called Spy Family that's about like a a spy needs to start a fake family to infiltrate a school. Like wildly different ideas, and all of them are incredibly popular. You
Yeah.
know, because
Well,
they'll
there was a spell where DC started saying, okay, let's put the manga art. So manga's popular. Let's do our comics in manga style. Nightwing became manga style, and all of a sudden he looked like he was a Japanese kid, and the sales tanked. And so what
yeah,
was the
because that
conclusion
misses
they
the
made
point.
was like, oh, people don't want manga art anymore. And I was like, it was never about the art. It was about the variety of story.
Mic on.
Exactly.
That art was terrible. That art was horrible. It was
It
horrendous.
was.
I don't care what they say. Like, sure, people can fake the manga style just like people fake the American comic style. But it's like if the quality and the talent isn't there, like you can't blame it. Like it drives me crazy on how blind people are on this stuff because it's like it's clearly bad. It's clearly like a third layer of pastiche. Like the amount of variety that's present in the current Shonen Jump is absolutely insane. And I'm not talking about the story. I'm talking about the different art styles within it.
Yeah, that's true too.
The most
Like,
popular manga is just a goofy art style that's like no other manga. Like it's its own thing. It's One Piece.
hmm
Yeah, but you look at Marvel and DC. What are they giving you? Nothing but superheroes.
Yep.
yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. And it's like the model is, this is where it just blows my mind. It blew my mind too with like the MCU and all of this. Now, the other thing that I want to mention that you brought up earlier, so before I forget, and since we're coming up on our time, I'm going to ask you to go over your other projects soon. So, but first, you mentioned that people don't want to be preached to, they don't like politics, and it just makes me think of how quickly this fall has happened, at least in the cinema, comics too, but also in the cinema, where it's like my model for how you would put a political story in a comic book setting is Captain America Civil War. I think they did it brilliantly. It was perfect how they did it because they took an issue that is not a real world issue. It is an issue that can only arise in the context of the MCU, the Sokovia Accords. Very clever idea. And then they had the heroes take various sides on the issue without making it clear like this side is right, this side is wrong. I still hear people who I respect on right the political aisle to this day argue vehemently in favor of both sides of
Right.
that fictional political issue,
Well, that's the way to
right?
do it. You don't pick a real issue. You create a fictional issue, and you don't try to ground it too much in the real world because you remember this is a fantasy world. This is where people escape to get away from the real world. So you can deal
hmm
with real world issues, but you got to do it in a creative way.
The
That's
clever thing, though, about the Sokovia Accords is that by presenting it in the way that they did, it allowed you to take real world values that people actually held and apply it to that fictional world. So,
right.
if you were more of a libertarian bent, then you wouldn't want them to sign the Sokovia Accords, right? Because it's government oversight. But if you were more of the bent that, well, they're a private operation needs some form of oversight or they're going to become corrupt, then you were going to be on Iron Man's side. And you were going to say, no, they need to be on some level. But the key here is there are no Sokovia Accords,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
Sokovia Accords
You
don't
can deal with real
actually
world
exist.
issues, but you do it in a fictional way. Yeah.
So I can have fun and debate that with my friends, and we can come away from the conversation without either of us hating each other afterward. You
Right.
know,
Now, with stores, I always allowed political discussions because I had one simple rule: everybody's right. You have the right to disagree with anybody. You don't ever get mad at somebody because they've got a different opinion than you. And every times I'd have to take sides with somebody I completely disagreed with, but I could tell they were just so outnumbered, they were losing, and so I'd have to, because I just wanted to keep things balanced, that everybody's opinions matter. And I guess that's why I got into politics. I'm on my second year term as the on the city council here where I live because I believe everybody's opinion matters. And unfortunately nowadays we've gotten into a type of rhetoric where if you don't agree with me, there's something wrong with you. And that's the wrong way. I mean, because it's like political debate is supposed to be a way of growth. It helps you define your arguments a little bit better, and you might learn something listening to somebody else's. But as it is, everybody wants to get into their bubble circles where all they're doing is hearing an echo chamber bouncing around, and they don't want to get outside that. And if you say anything they don't agree with you,
yeah.
oh my gosh.
And it's so difficult because to an extent I do understand it on some level, because there are certain things that, like, you or I or whatever, we might feel so strongly about that we think like you are attacking something that is fundamental to how I live my life. Like,
Yeah.
I can't just let you do that. But they feel the same way about things I feel are strongly about.
Well,
And
there's
I
a
think that's one
difference
of the
between
reasons.
discussion and argument.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that in a fictional context, like, I agree with you. I think that the proper way to do it, and like I said, I think that Captain America Civil War honestly did this brilliantly. Like, I'm so impressed by how they did it. It's my model for how I look at how you would do this is you would create this fictional issue that you could analyze with real world principles, and then you could actually have that debate play out. Yeah.
Listen,
And
guys.
it's a
Listen, I
clever
am
idea.
totally against scroll human marriage. It disgusts me. I absolutely can't stand the mixing of alien races with human
But
races.
but Ben, if the squirrels are sapient, then what's the moral issue?
I'm
They can
just
consent.
saying
I can consent.
Squirrel Girl uplifting squirrels does not make it a sentient being. It's disgusting. Uh,
Sometimes people
But
just get so caught up and I'm right and I will not. I remember I had one guy who was in my store and he was very kind of like Black Lives Matter militant. And he's like any, tear down all the statues, any kind of representation of slave ownership should be destroyed and burnt. I said, you really mean any representation of slave ownership? It should be burned? He goes, yeah, absolutely. On the spot, no discussion. I was like, well, you got a bunch of pictures of slave owners in your wallet right now. Are you going to burn your money? He got a look on his face. He went out the door, and that was the end of that. I didn't have. He never bought anything anyway. He just always wanted to come in and kick a fuss about something, and that was the last time I heard from that guy because he just like all of a sudden his argument just got shot out of the air, and he had no comeback, and he was gone. You got some crazy people walking in your store sometimes. I mean, it's like you talk about Star Wars. Oh man, I remember I was going to go see the first one of the new trilogy because there was a lot of high hopes when those things
yeah,
came back. And there's some guy like which one? No, no, I take it back. This is an earlier Star Wars. This also happened on that one too. Though where they kill Han Solo and the guy hits the door like, don't tell me a thing. I'm going to see it tonight. Oh, Han Solo's dead, and he runs out the door like, you better run. But there was a case where I think,
that's very funny.
oh, I know people do stuff like that. They're just mean.
It's mean. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong. It is mean,
yeah.
but
It's
it's
like
very funny.
there was a case, and this happened I remember reading it in the paper about a guy who's like walking out going, "Hey, the Darth Vader is Luke's dad," and he probably got beat up by a couple of stormtroopers. And the police came and said, "Yeah, that's justifiable.
Yeah,
Go
I
on."
remember when the sixth Harry Potter book came out, they had skywriters putting Dumbledore's dead and fly it across, or Snape killed Dumbledore and they had it fly across the sky.
Yeah.
Uh, we're at the final 5 minutes, so you said you had 11 books coming out. Let's do
Oh
the
yeah.
quick rundown of things we should be
All
looking
right.
forward to.
Well, besides the Skydance, see, I've got another project that's coming out right now. My Wild Stars runs in every issue crossover, and my latest novel, Wild Stars 7, The Gold Exigency, is cover featured on the newest issue of crossover, which is a return of some characters that first appeared in a magazine I published. I was talking about earlier, the Multiversal Scribe, back in 1977. Some other stuff I've got coming out, and this came back from the printer, and this is the Robert E. Howard chronology.
ooh.
This is and these things are massive. I mean, they weigh like about 8 pounds each, and I don't know if I can wrangle this to kind of give you
Unfor-
a flip through all the.
Unfortunately, our people can't see it, but I assure
Oh,
you, this is a magnificent piece.
okay.
Uh, this is. I am salivating at the mouth, and I'll surely pimp this out as soon as we have it on public availability.
All right, and then see back to Crossover though. Here's like the previous Wild Stars novel, then that they serialized. The one that they serialized before that, they've actually got out as a novel in multiple covers. This is Wild Stars 5, the Atomic Paradigm, and then they've also have all of my previous Wild Stars collected together in paperback. But they also did it all together in one big omnibus.
Very cool.
Oh
And
yeah, I remember that cover. That's a 10 out of 10 cover.
yeah, so I've got all those different chronology books here, but you said don't bother showing them because nobody can see them there. But yeah, so
Yeah,
that That was a major project. I mean, 2.5 years of my life working on that thing.
And it looks like I wish I could show, the audience this, but it does look amazing, and I'll certainly have to whip up a Robert Howard stream soon for it.
Or give them a link to my website. I show all this stuff on there.
Absolutely, I did put up the WildStar website on the chat. Let's just go over some comments real quick. Uh, let's see. P. Alexander. Sometimes good enough is great when you've gotten used to bad, even back in the 70s. Marvel DC fighting over license. Magnus. Valiant Magnus. Lee's writing. A lot of Lee's writing is unreadable. Stanley, I guess. I used
Oh,
to.
Stan,
Yeah.
when I started seeing Stan Lee's name on a book, cut the orders because he didn't sell anymore. He was all reputation and no delivery.
Oh, yeah. Mike Barr, Forgotten. Uh, Meanwhile, Bill Willingham was doing subversive indie work back in the 80s and is still doing critically acclaimed contemporary work. And P. Alexander is off to walk his dog. I want to thank you for joining us today, Michael Tierney. I know this is mostly you and Anthony's show. Uh,
Oh, I'll
but
do presentation.
but I always enjoy bringing out and advertising Kursova's work because he is a man, and the people he gathers around him are men who deliver, and that is more important than a whole lot of things, because not much matters if there's no evidence of our work. Uh, do check out Pinkerton's Ghosts. Do check out Kursova Magazine. Do check out all of us where you can find us. Anthony, do you have anything else for us?
Uh, no, except that I had a good time on this show. It was a fun conversation.
Thank you. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Goodbye.